confident in the economy in the 1920s. This whole roaring 20s carefree mentality of Americans buying stuff on credit led them to purchase stocks on margin in the most risky way you possibly could. We talked about how banks had lent money to people that they probably shouldn't have been lending to. And when the stock market crashed on Black Tuesday, banks started to go bankrupt. People started to lose their life savings. Americans panicked. There was a run on the banks, which compounded the issue. We also took a look at the fact that the policies that had created the roaring 20s are now returning to haunt us. We raised tariffs. We engaged in what we call Yankee imperialism, where Americans, instead of rebuilding Europe after World War I, used the situation to build the American economy and create the roaring 20s. And therefore, when the huge stockpiles occurred, the best option would have been to trade overseas, but we couldn't because European markets weren't in any condition to trade with the United States, which made the depression now become global. We also talked about how the supply side economics of the 1920s in theory worked and for a short period of time generated the wealth of the roaring 20s. And we see that generally speaking, these types of policies where you increase tariffs, cut spending for the government, reduce taxes for the wealthiest people, and encourage the wealthy to spend their money to create jobs for the poor, did create economic prosperity for the short term. But in the long term, what they did was they created what we call a pyramid of wealth. And we talked about the fact that basically the 1920s, those roaring 20s, were basically becoming a grand illusion. Americans had the illusion that everybody was making more money. They had the illusion that everybody was working and the jobs were abundant and Americans were secure and feeling good about themselves and spending more money. And while all of that was true, what really was happening in the roaring 20s is not that the average American was making more money, but that more Americans were making some money. And what was really happening was, yes, a lot of those policies of supply-side economics did generate a lot of wealth for the upper class, and they did spend that money, and it did create more jobs for the lower class. But the idea that that money would trickle down through the economy did not happen. And so what we have at the end of the roaring 20s is a giant pyramid of wealth, where an overwhelming majority of the country's money belongs to an incredibly small number of people, and most Americans don't have enough money to secure themselves once you head into something like the Great Depression. And so, for example, last lecture we discussed Henry Ford as a great example of the roaring 20s heading into the Great Depression. While Henry Ford was willing to do the things that are required to help pull out of the Great Depression, he reduced the price of the Model T. He increased his employees' wages. That is all exactly what you would want them to do. The problem is there's only one Henry Ford. Now, to compound everything and make it worse, you have the average American worker working in factories losing their entire life savings, some of them because they had speculated unwisely, and some of them simply because they had been unlucky. We saw Americans panic and they had all run to the banks at the same time, which caused massive nationwide bankruptcies, which compounded the issues. And we also see the fact that the pyramid of wealth didn't help things. But on the other hand, we see that it even goes a step further, where Americans started to feel like nature was even against them at some point in time. The one group of people who in particular did not enjoy the wealth and prosperity of the roaring 20s was the American farmer. Most farmers did not enjoy the wealth, mainly because farmers don't have the ability to control their own markets. The price of wheat is what the price of wheat is. Wheat from one farmer is very similar to wheat from another farmer, and so therefore, whatever the markets are, that's what they get. And so what we see as a result is during the 1920s, as technology improved with products like the Model Ts and everything, so did farming equipment. And so what we see happen in the roaring 20s is farmers started to produce more. In order to keep up with the lifestyle of the roaring 20s, farmers had to take out loans to buy equipment. And if you're a farmer and you want to make more money, the best way to do so is to grow more crops. And so we see across the Midwest, the breadbasket of the United States, those Great Plains, farmers are now farming exorbitant amounts of crops that they typically hadn't been growing prior to that period of time. Now, here's the problem for farmers. It's a double-edged sword. The more you produce, the more money you'll make off of your crops. But if every farmer grows considerably more acreage of crops now, the overall price of those crops goes down. Simple supply and demand. The more corn you put out, the cheaper corn becomes. The more wheat you put out, the cheaper wheat gets. And so therefore, as those farmers took out loans to grow more crops, it worked. They bought equipment, which helped them to plow more land, which helped them to grow more crops, which also brought down the price of their product. And therefore, farmers were the one group that did not experience the wealth of the Roaring '20s. So when banks started to foreclose on people's farms and banks started to go bankrupt, the one group of people that didn't have any money to fall back on to save themselves was the farmers. So you might say that a farmer would be in good shape whenever something like the stock market crash happens. Typically that might be true, but not in this case. Not when most of those farmers were beholden to banks who are now trying to collect to save themselves. And so on top of all of this, while the farmers were struggling to make their bills and their payments, at the same time when the stock market crashes and America is in a very precarious situation after the Black Tuesday incident, in the early 1930s, beginning in 1931, America experienced a massive drought, which killed many of those crops out there in the Midwest. And as those crops started to dry up and the winds started to blow through, because the farmers had farmed so much more land than they had been up until that point in time, they created a phenomenon we call the Dust Bowl, which is a reference to the Midwestern states of the United States and poor farmers who lost their land and starved because of the drought of the 1930s. What happened was these farmers through a massive portion of the country had farmed so much more land than they typically had before, that when the rain stopped and it dried out and the winds blew through there, it blew off all the topsoil, which made it incredibly more difficult for them to grow crops. Farmers don't grow crops, they don't get money, they don't feed their families. It makes them very difficult to keep their farms and survive. Then the year after the Dust Bowl hits, 1932, the rains come back, it looks like they're gonna grow crops, and then farmers were hit by a phenomenon that happens once every 20 to 25 years. Locusts coming out of the Rocky Mountains had hatched, and as they make their way across the country, these massive groups of locusts move through the Great Plains, and guess what they eat? They eat the crops of those farmers. The year after 1932, 1933, the locusts are gone, but guess what returns? The droughts. And so you have 3 years in a row where either droughts or plagues of locusts have now destroyed these farmers' crops, and they cannot get surviving this situation, which leads to